storylines. I'm looking at you, True Blood. How did you get them to stay so true to your complex as all hell novels?
Candy and chocolates. It's David and Dan, really. David Benioff and Dan Weiss are the showrunners. I don't have any veto power. I signed a pretty standard contract where I gave them rights to adapt this into a television series, and I got certain titles and the agreement I'd write one script a year and a large dump truck full of money, and they can they can have the aliens come down next season. They can turn the whole cast into vampires, and I'm powerless to stop them. But I don't think they will do that. They love the books, and they seem committed to telling my story in a different medium. And I knew all that before I signed any of the contracts. I mean, when these books started hitting the New York Times bestseller list, which was as early as Clash of Kings, I was approached by other people who wanted to adapt them, many for feature films. And I had meetings with those people and, heard their plans. How are they going to fit this giant thing in a feature film? Well, we're going to make it all about Jon Snow and we'll drop all these other characters. Or we'll make it all about Dany and we'll drop all these other characters. They had various schemes or of how they would do it. We'll just make the first book up to this point, and then we hope that the movie will do well enough to order a second movie, and none of these really appealed to me, so I said no, which it's always said that no is the sexiest word you can say in Hollywood. The more you say no, the more they want you, and I guess that was true because they kept coming, and eventually David and Dan came, and we had a wonderful meeting that lasted like most of a day. We met for lunch, and we were talking and getting all animated about how we were going to do the series over lunch and in a crowded restaurant in Los Angeles. And little by little, it emptied out, and pretty soon we were the only people there, drinking our 7th cup of coffee and iced tea and still talking about it. And then more hours passed, and we're still talking in the restaurant. The dinner crowd is coming in, and they're setting up for dinner. I think we closed that restaurant that night. So it was one of those classic meetings that you only get once in a while, but I had a great feeling about them. I mean, if you're J.K. Rowling, you can go into a situation where every studio in Hollywood wants you, and you can set very stringent terms where you get to approve everything. But if you're not J.K. Rowling, and virtually nobody is J.K. Rowling except for J.K. Rowling, then you can't do that, and you have to find people that you trust and put your faith in them and in the understanding of the story. Which is something that I think I also understood a fair amount of that because of my 10 years working in Hollywood and the fact that I had seen the other side of the process. Sometimes I think some of my fellow novelists who have not worked in television and film are very naive about this process. They get an offer, and there's the dump truck full of money, and they sign it, they cash the check, and then they're not involved in the series. They may get invited to the premiere, and they come out of the premiere looking like all of their children have just been gassed, and with a stunned look on their face because everything has been changed, and it's some of them get very upset and start writing angry editorials and things like that. I haven't heard of anyone except Alan Moore actually returning the check, however. So I think there's a certain hypocrisy there. It's not a secret that Hollywood does change things, and maybe they change too many things. And when I have my writer hat off and I put on my reader, my fanboy hat, I get, upset as anyone, and I can go on for a long time about, how they change things in Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four in ways that I don't approve of. But nonetheless, you got to know the job is dangerous when you take it,
Great. Have you ever been influenced by some of the crazy theories your fans come up with for mysteries in the books? Have you ever changed an aspect of your story based on fan feedback, i.e. if one of their theories is better than what you originally planned?
No, but I am concerned about that possibility, which is one of the reasons I don't tend to read the fan boards. I mean, when the first fan boards started occurring and they started theorizing and analyzing the books in such detail, and I'm going back now to the mid-'90s, really, when the first boards appeared. Dragonstone, coming out of Australia, that Peter Gibb ran, I think was the first board I was aware of. And a couple others came up after that. I was very flattered, and I did read all the theories. And then precisely this point occurred where it says, you know, what if they're guessing the things that I haven't revealed yet? What if they guessed them correctly? How does that affect me? Do I then say, oh my God, they figured it out already, I better change it? Or do I just ignore it and plow ahead? And what if they come up with better ideas than the ones I had? Do I steal them? And I didn't like any of these possibilities, so I said it would be better for me to try to keep my distance and not go on these boards and try to. Somehow it's a futile effort because people also write me emails and people come to public forums like this and you know, they come up to me at signings and whisper their theories in my ear and things like that. So I am kind of aware of some of the speculation out there, but I try to keep my distance from it precisely because I don't want to be impacted. I mean, you know, it's one of the drawbacks of the whole internet culture and this world that you guys have created. That something that previously maybe one reader in 1,000 would have guessed, but you still had the other 999 who would have no inkling until you reveal it in a book. Now that one person in 1,000 puts it on an internet message board and everybody sees it and they say, oh yeah, that's right. Now I see the clues, I got it. And pretty soon half the readership, or at least the internet savvy portion of your readership, knows it. But what do you do then? Do you change it and come up with something goofy and outlandish that you haven't done the foreshadowing for, that you haven't laid the foundation for, just in order to surprise people? I mean, sure, I could have like aliens come down and that would certainly surprise the hell out of everybody. No one is predicting that, but it would ruin the series. So basically, you can't let yourself be influenced by this stuff, and I try not to.
So let's start talking about this new book, The World of Ice and Fire. I've been telling people who ask me about it that it's sort of the Silmarillion of your imaginary world. And you wrote it with a couple of co-authors, so I'd love to hear you talk about whether it is the Silmarillion of the known world, and about what it was like to work with Elio and Linda.
Well, this is a book that really began with my readers and my fans. Of course, in any epic fantasy, the world is a character. Setting is very important. And that, I think, has certainly been true since J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. Of course, fantasy goes back to ancient times, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Ballad of Gilgamesh. But Tolkien really invented modern epic fantasy in its current form. And one of the things he did that was extraordinary was create Middle-earth in such detail. If you look at some of the pre-Tolkien fantasy, it's written more in the story of fairy tales, you know. Once upon a time, there was a king, and the king had a beautiful daughter, and there was an evil vizier, and they may have names, but you won't know, like, who was the king's father, or who was his grandfather, or how the dynasty came to power, or how long it's ruled, or what the neighboring countries are. It's all told in this fairy tale thing. Tolkien gave us all these histories, all these appendices and genealogies, and everything was rooted, and it seemed as real as England or France or Germany when you read these things. And since then, that's become the style for epic fantasy. It's something that fantasy readers now expect. They expect a a fully realized secondary world, as Tolkien called it. And so certainly that's what I set out to create in Westeros. Now, some of this is a magician's trick. It really wasn't with Tolkien. You have to consider that Tolkien was a very, very unusual writer. I mean, he was a linguist and a philosopher, and he spoke Old Norse and Old English. He was fascinated by myth. You know, the story was almost secondary to Tolkien. He spent years creating his Silmarillion, never published it in his lifetime. And Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit were like stories set in the world he created, but for him, the world creation and the creation of languages was almost primary. If you look at it like an iceberg, you know, they say the 3/4 of an iceberg is hidden below the surface. That was certainly true with Tolkien. With a lot of the fantasists who have followed Tolkien, though, it's a magician's trick. We have some ice on a raft, and we want you to think that there's this huge edifice underneath, just like with Tolkien, but there really isn't in some cases. And that was probably true with me in the beginning. I mean, I began with the story and the characters and the scene, and everything grew from that. But the world grew along with the story, and I rapidly discovered as I got into the writing that the readers wanted to know more and more about this world. And they would send me emails and letters saying, this Dance with the Dragons that you mentioned, can you tell me more about that? It sounds fascinating. Aegon's conquest, how did Aegon conquer the 7 kingdoms when, you know, he only had a little army? You mentioned that, but I don't understand how it worked. Could you write me about that, or could you write a book about that? And you know, as the years passed, a lot of these letters came in. And some of the earliest ones came in from Elio and Linda. Elio Garcia Jr. And Linda Ann Thompson. Elio is an American who lives in Sweden with his Swedish girlfriend, Linda, and they were among the earliest fans to get in touch with me way back in the middle 90s, and they wanted to run a game, and they had a million questions, and they displayed right away an almost obsessive knowledge of my world. In fact, I had to alter my world because of that obsessive knowledge. When, you know, in one of the earliest appendices that I created was, well, who are the kings who came before King Robert, who was king? We know that King Robert had usurped his throne from the Mad King, and before that there had been Aegon the Conqueror and the Targaryen conquest. Well, who are all the kings in between? So I invented a bunch of kings' names and dates, and I put that in the back of the first edition of Game of Thrones. And I had, you know, well, this is the first son of the second son, you know, this is the younger brother of. And everything was fine there until I wrote the Dunk and Egg story. The first Dunk and Egg story, The Hedge Knight, which was set 100 years before the main Ice and Fire story.
This is a set of, just in case anybody is not familiar with these, is 3 short stories.
3 novellas so
3
far,
novellas, okay.
but there will be more. Yeah, and it's set 90 years before the events of A Song of Ice and Fire, and I had some Targaryens in that, and Elio and Linda looked at the date that was set in and compared it to the date, and they looked at, oh, this guy, you say in The Hedge Knight that this guy is like 35 years old, but that, you know, if you compare it to the dates given in the chronology that you had in book 1, he can't possibly be older than 7. Because of how old were these people when they had the children and all that. And I went through all these dates, and damned if he wasn't right. So I had to change the list of Targaryen kings, and someone who had previously been a son now became a younger brother. So all the dates would work. But that impressed me right there that Elio and Linda really knew this stuff. So fast forward, as the years go by, I got more and more requests for something like this, a concordance or a world book. A number of other fantasy authors had done these, you know, the so-and-so companion or the concordance or whatever. I said, okay, we'll do one too, and I'll have Elio and Linda come in, and they can do all the hard work. because they keep track of the stuff better than I am. And we signed a contract back in 2008, I think it was. It was supposed to be delivered in, a couple years. We know how that works. And like many of my projects, it got, not only did it become late, but it got much bigger than it initially had begun. And I wound up creating a lot more material. The initial approach was, Elio and Linda were going to go through the whole book, and they were going to, all of the published books, and even some of the unpublished manuscripts at that point, and they were going to organize all the historical references and, kind of beat out an outline and a rough draft, which they would then send to me, and I would polish that and revise that and fill it out, and I would fill in the gaps, because inevitably there would be big gaps where I didn't say anything. And we were going to have a history and a who's who. And we started working on that. Elio and Linda really started working on the who's who. And the who's who got so gigantically big with like thousands of characters that we said, we have like 500,000 words of who's who. So we took that out and we put that on the app. So that's the World of Ice and Fire app, and you can find all the who's who's here. Everybody who's ever walked on stage and said, ouch, I'm wounded, will be mentioned there in the who's who. And then we concentrated on this, which is a book of history and legends, and I also wanted it to be beautiful. I'd looked at some of these other books that had been done. And some of them were pretty nice looking, but others were not. In fact, I won't mention names, but there's one prominent fantasy writer whose own fans call his concordance the big book of bad art. So I was determined that my book not have bad art. I wanted great art, lots of art on every page, a coffee table book heavily illustrated, by some of the top fantasy illustrators in the world, and that's what we set out to get, and that's what we got. People like Magali Villeneuve and Ted Naismith and Mark Simonetti, Michael Comark. We used a lot of art from Fantasy Flight Games, which has generated some wonderful art for the Game of Thrones card game and board game, and it is always finding some great artists from around the world for us. So, all of that was very exciting. As usual, it grew bigger than anticipated. Our initial budget was that we were supposed to provide them with 50,000 words of text. And the rest would all be art. And it would be a nice book. Elio and Linda, by the time they finished their portion of the thing, provided me with 70,000 words of text, just working on the stuff in there. And then I was supposed to add some sidebars, filling in gaps. And, I did with things I knew about history that I'd already made up the stories and the characters, and I knew kind of how they worked, but I hadn't found a place to put them in the novels. So I'll put them in here as sidebars. So I wrote like 300,000 words of sidebars. So at that point, my editor's head exploded. Anne is somewhere in the audience. You'll recognize her by her exploded head. And it was pointed out that we couldn't actually publish this book. I wanted art on every page, and we had all this art that we bought and paid for, but if we put in all these words, then the art would be like a picture every 10 pages. So we had to sort of get back to at least closer to the original concept. So we wound up actually abridging many of my sidebars, and so what you're saying. So Elio and Linda worked on that, and Anne worked on that, and we got basically the outline of the histories and stuff in there, but not the fully detailed versions that I wrote. So when you say, "Is this your Silmarillion?" the answer is, well, kind of, but no, because I'm going to take all those sidebars and write more sidebars, and somewhere down the line, the full versions of all this stuff will be published, and we've been calling that the Grimmarillion. That's mostly about the Targaryen kings and the whole history of Westeros. That's really the focus of that book, will be focused on the Targaryens. This book has a shorter version of that in, but it also has the regional histories of each of the regions of Westeros and the noble houses, and it has a lot of material about the 9 free cities and the civilizations of Essos and the Summer Islands, and even some stuff about the Basic Islands and the further east and the furthest east, and et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of great stuff. I hope you guys enjoy it. It was a lot of fun to write, I'll tell you that much.
This is from Jolene. She says, what was your intent in providing such female characters of strength in a genre that typically reduces women to witches, wives, and/or whores?
Well, to be fair, I have my share of all of those witches, wives, and whores, but I try to make them fully fleshed out human witches, wives, and whores, and as well to introduce other things. Well, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about common humanity. It seems strange that I have to say this. It's sort of a weirdly radical statement, but women are people, and they're driven by the same desires that drive men. I think a desire for respect and power, a desire to protect their children, greed for money, for acclaim. Everybody wants to be loved. It's all common humanity, and I just try to write my female characters as I write my male characters. I do take into account that it's a very patriarchal society, so they are limited to certain roles, and some of them fit comfortably within the roles that their Westerosi society has assigned them, and some of them do not fit comfortably into those roles, and therefore encounter a certain amount of rejection or tension or ridicule as they try to pursue their own dreams, or as they frustrate their own dreams. And all this is great. All this is conflict. It's character tension. It's what story is all about, the human heart in conflict with itself once again. And one of the things that pleases me no end is that I have so many women readers, and that they do write me all the time and say that they really like my female characters. So that I am very pleased with that.
Well, George, we got dozens and dozens and dozens more questions, but I'm going to have to call it quits right now.
Okay,
Thanks.
well, we'll do it again next book.
Now here we have I believe it's the Battle of the Trident. It's Robert Baratheon, who is the king who at the beginning of Game of Thrones, and he's fighting Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, who is Daenerys' brother, and he's also the heir to the throne of the Mad King Aerys, who was shortly after this killed by Jaime Lannister. I got that right?
That's right.
Okay.
This is one of the key scenes in A Song of Ice and Fire that occurs, before the books open. But it sets the stage and everything that follows. Let's see, this is Justin Sweet, right? The painting?
Yes.
Yes, Justin. Incredible artist, Justin Sweet. He's done some magnificent work for us. We've had several great artists do the Battle of the Trident scene. What I like about Justin's version particularly is that he actually included the horses, because the two of them did fight on horseback, but most of the other artists who have illustrated the scene for one reason or another have omitted the horses and have just shown the two men on foot. In that sense, they're quite a lot like the TV show, which omits the horses at many opportunities. So where the TV show is short on horses. But we have horses here, and that's good. So the two of them were fighting in the middle of the Trident, the ford of the Trident, and it was a whole turning point where everything that occurs in the books was set up by this fight between two men.
It's great to see them at this point looking you know, in the prime of their lives and so heroic, because by the time we jump into the narrative of Game of Thrones, Robert is kind of over the hill. It makes you, I mean, this makes you see why he was, you know, why people thought so highly of him to begin with.
Yeah, Robert was like me when I began this. My hair was dark, I was skinnier, it was, you know, I was different in 91. Hey.
You know, it's also, you know, Rhaegar has kidnapped Robert's betrothed and Ned's sister, but it's really the culmination of a lot of forces. I mean, this is a big personal confrontation, but it's also kind of a big, you know, kind of socio-political confrontation. The Targaryens, King Aerys was crazy, and their sort of line seemed to be kind of decaying.
Well, one of the factors here is, of course, that 300 years ago in Aegon's conquest, the Targaryens conquered the Seven Kingdoms with dragons. But then, during the later civil war called the Dance with the Dragons, the majority of those dragons were killed. And the few that survived that war died a relatively short time later, or else left the known lands of Westeros. So by that point, the Targaryens were firmly established as the kings and had, you know, the power of tradition and legitimacy behind them. Generations had come up of age with the idea of the Targaryens were the king, and that the rules didn't apply to them. I mean, that was also part of it. You know, Targaryens were interlopers from another culture, and they had some unique factors that didn't necessarily fit into the mainstream of the other Westerosi lords, such as their traditional incest, you know, which was part of keeping the bloodlines pure so that they could better control the dragons, brother marrying sister, and you know, nephews and aunts and so forth, and all of that is detailed in the book, all of the matches and so forth. But by the time this comes around, the Targaryens have not had dragons for a long time, and I guess Robert and some of the other lords are starting to say, you know, we don't really have to be that afraid of these guys.